She looked at him like she already knew what he had done, and for a man who had spent 10 years making sure no one knew anything about him, that was enough to make Ethan Cole forget how to breathe for a second too long. The kind of second that stretches thin under a high desert sun, where even the wind seems to wait and watch. And the dust along the narrow creek bed held still, as if the land itself had taken notice of something neither of them had spoken aloud. Not yet. Maybe not ever. Ethan stood beside his horse with one hand resting loosely on the worn leather saddle, the other hanging near his belt, not out of threat, but habit. A habit carved from years of keeping distance from anything that looked like trouble. And trouble out here didn't always wear a gun or raise its voice. Sometimes it just stood quiet across 10 yards of pale sand and looked at you like it had been expecting you all along. The girl hadn't moved since he first saw her, not even when his boots crunched the last few feet toward the water's edge, her figure still against the slow current, dark hair catching the light in strands that moved softer than the breeze, her dress simple, earth-toned, carrying the scent of sage and river stone that drifted faintly even from where he stood, and it wasn't fear in her eyes. Not the kind he was used to seeing when strangers crossed paths in lands that remembered more than people did. It was something steadier, something older, like recognition without introduction. Ethan had seen enough of the frontier to know that nothing came without reason, not silence, not stillness, not a gaze that didn't break, and he felt it then, a quiet pressure behind his ribs, not panic, not quite, but the sense that something was about to be uncovered whether he wanted it or not. He glanced once toward the ridge beyond her, where the heat shimmered just enough to blur the edges of the horizon, half expecting movement, riders, anything that would explain why she stood there alone. But the land gave him nothing back, just the long stretch of empty that men like him had learned to trust and fear in equal measure. "You're a long way from anywhere," he said finally, his voice low, not unkind, but careful, like a man testing the depth of water before stepping in, and she didn't answer, not with words, only that same look, unwavering, searching, as if his voice had only confirmed something she already believed. Ethan shifted his weight, the leather of his boots creaking softly, and for a moment he considered turning back, leading his horse away, leaving whatever this was to settle into the dust behind him, because he had built his life on leaving things alone, on walking past questions that didn't belong to him. But something held him there, something in the way her eyes didn't accuse and didn't ask, they simply knew, and that was worse. The creek moved between them with a slow, steady rhythm, water sliding over smooth stones worn down by years that had erased sharper edges, and Ethan found himself watching that movement, trying to anchor his thoughts to something simple, something real, but it didn't help, because the feeling stayed, growing quieter, but heavier, like a memory trying to surface through layers he had kept buried for too long. She took one step forward then, just one, enough to close the distance by a single pace, and the sound of it, soft against the sand, seemed louder than it should have been, enough to draw his attention back to her face, to the calm there, the certainty, and he realized with a clarity that settled cold and clean that she wasn't guessing. She wasn't mistaken. Whatever she saw when she looked at him, it was something real, something tied to him whether he chose to claim it or not. The sun shifted higher, casting sharper light across the creek, catching on the faint shimmer of something at her neck, a small piece of turquoise wrapped in worn silver, and for just a fraction of a second, Ethan's chest tightened, not from fear, not from danger, but from recognition that came too fast and too quiet to ignore, and he didn't understand it yet, not fully, but he knew one thing as sure as the ground. Beneath his boots, that look she gave him wasn't the beginning of something new. It was the return of something old, something that had been waiting, patient as the land, for the moment he would finally stand still long enough to see it. Ethan did not move when she stepped closer, but something in him shifted the way a long, closed door loosens on its hinges after years of being untouched, subtle, quiet, but impossible to ignore, and he found himself watching not just her face but the way she carried herself, balanced, grounded, like someone who belonged to the land rather than passing through it. And that alone set her apart from most of the people he had known in the past decade. People who took from the land, measured it, divided it, sold it, but never really listened to it. He had built his life around not listening, around keeping his world small and manageable. One ranch, a handful of cattle, a routine that did not ask questions and did not invite answers. And for 10 years that had been enough, more than enough, because silence did not judge and solitude did not remember, but standing there now, with that quiet creek moving between them, and that girl watching him like she could see past everything he had chosen to become, he felt the edges of that life begin to blur. He cleared his throat once, more to steady himself than to speak, and adjusted the brim of his hat slightly lower against the sun, buying himself a moment, just one, but she did not look away, not even when his shadow shifted across the ground. And it occurred to him then that most people looked at a man like him and saw what he allowed them to see. A rancher, a drifter who stayed too long in one place. A man who kept to himself because he preferred it that way, but she did not look at him like that. She looked at him like she was reading something written underneath all of that. Something older than the dust on his boots and the lines in his face. "You should not be here alone," he said, the words coming out slower than he intended. Not as a warning, but as a statement of fact shaped by years of knowing how quickly things could change out here, how silence could turn into something else without notice. But again she did not answer, and instead her gaze softened, just enough to change its weight, not less intense, but different, like the difference between a question and an understanding. Ethan felt it then, the faint pull of memory, not clear enough to name, not sharp enough to grasp, but present, like a scent carried on the wind that you recognize without knowing why. And he frowned slightly, his eyes narrowing not at her, but at the feeling itself, because he did not like things he could not place, did not trust thoughts that came without reason. His horse shifted behind him, a quiet huff of breath breaking the stillness for a moment, and Ethan reached back without looking, resting his hand against the animal's neck in a familiar motion, grounding himself in something known, something simple. But even that did not fully steady him, because the girl had taken another step, slow, deliberate, and now there were only a few yards between them, close enough that he could see the fine lines of dust along her sleeves, the way her fingers hung relaxed at her sides, not tense, not ready, just present, and it struck him how little fear there was in her posture, not the kind born from ignorance, but the kind that comes from knowing something others do not. "Do I know you?" he asked then. And this time the question came out quieter, stripped of its earlier caution, carrying something closer to uncertainty. And for the first time since he had seen her, she moved her gaze slightly, not away, but downward, toward the ground between them, as if considering the weight of the question rather than the words themselves. When she looked back up, there was something different in her eyes, something that settled into place like the final piece of a thought he had not finished forming. And though she still did not speak, he understood that the answer was not simple, not something that could be given in a single word or even a sentence, and that unsettled him more than anything else, because simple answers were the only kind he allowed himself these days. The breeze picked up just enough to carry the scent of water and sage more clearly, brushing past them both in a quiet line that connected the space they stood in, and Ethan felt that same strange recognition deepen, not into clarity, but into certainty that whatever stood between them was not chance, not coincidence, but something set in motion long before this moment, long before he had chosen this life of quiet distances and careful boundaries. And for the first time in years, he realized that some things did not stay buried just because a man decided to leave them behind. Some things waited, patient and unchanging, until the right pair of eyes found him again and refused to look away. The silence between them did not break all at once. It shifted, like the first sign of movement in still water, and Ethan felt it before he saw it. The subtle change in the way she stood, the way her shoulders eased just slightly as if a decision had been made somewhere beneath the surface. And then she raised her hand, slow enough that it carried no threat, only intention, and for a moment he thought she might point, might accuse, might call something into the open that he had spent years keeping hidden. But instead her fingers moved to the small turquoise stone at her neck, brushing it lightly as though it were not just an object, but a memory held in place. Ethan's breath caught again, quieter this time, because the sight of that stone stirred something deeper than recognition, something that did not belong to the present moment at all, and he found himself staring at it, at the worn edges of the silver wrapping, at the way it sat against her skin like it had always been there. And he knew, without understanding how he knew, that he had seen something like it before, not here, not now, but somewhere far behind him in a time he rarely allowed himself to revisit. The creek continued its steady movement beside them, the sound soft but constant, like a reminder that time did not stop just because a man wanted it to, and Ethan shifted his weight again, this time not out of caution, but because the ground beneath him no longer felt as certain as it had a few minutes ago, as if the past he had left behind was beginning to rise up through the present, changing its shape. She stepped closer once more, closing the distance until only a few feet remained, and still there was no fear in her, no hesitation, only that same steady calm. And when she finally spoke, her voice was low, clear, carrying the kind of quiet strength that did not need to be raised to be heard. "You kept something," she said, and the words settled between them with a weight that was not heavy but undeniable, like a truth that had been waiting for the right moment to be spoken. Ethan blinked once, the question forming before he could stop it, but he did not ask it, because something in the way she said those words told him that she was not asking, she was reminding, and that unsettled him more than anything else had so far, because he did not remember keeping anything, not from anyone, not in any way that mattered. He had made sure of that, made sure that when he left things behind, they stayed behind, and yet as he stood there, looking at her, at that stone, at the calm certainty in her eyes, he felt the edges of that certainty begin to fray. "I do not know what you mean," he said, and his voice sounded different to his own ears, less grounded, less sure, as if the words themselves did not fully belong to him. And she studied him for a moment longer, not with doubt, not with suspicion, but with a kind of patience that suggested she had expected that answer, as though she understood that some memories took longer to return than others. She reached down then, slowly, her movements deliberate, and from the fold of her dress, she drew out a small piece of cloth, faded with time, its edges worn and softened by years of being handled, and she held it out toward him without stepping any closer, offering it across that narrow space between them. And Ethan felt his chest tighten as his eyes dropped to it, because even before he took it, even before his fingers closed around the fabric, he knew in the same quiet, certain way that had been building inside him since he first saw her, that this was not something new, not something unfamiliar. This was something that had once been his. His hand moved almost without his permission, reaching out, taking the cloth from her, and the moment his skin touched it, something shifted, not in the world around him, but inside him, like a door opening onto a place he had sealed away, and the texture of it, rough but worn smooth in places, the faint discoloration that time had not erased, all of it came together in a way that did not ask for understanding. It simply brought it, and Ethan's fingers tightened slightly around it as the memory began to surface, not all at once, not clearly, but enough to make him realize that whatever he had tried to forget had not been lost. It had only been waiting, just like she had, just like this moment, patient and unyielding, until he was standing here with no place left to turn but back toward it. The cloth felt heavier than it should have in Ethan's hand, not because of its weight, but because of what it carried, and he stood there for a long moment without looking up, his eyes fixed on the worn fabric as if it might shift or change if he stared at it long enough. But it did not. It stayed exactly as it was, patient, unchanged, waiting for him to catch up to it, and slowly, without meaning to, he turned it between his fingers, tracing the edge where it had once been torn, not clean, not careful, but urgent, necessary. And that was what broke through first, not a full memory, not a clear picture, just the feeling of urgency, of hands moving quickly, of a moment where there had been no time to think, only to act. The creek beside them continued its quiet rhythm, but now it sounded different to him, deeper somehow, like it was carrying echoes instead of just water, and Ethan felt his breath shift, growing slower, heavier, as if each inhale was pulling something old back into him, piece by piece. He could not see it yet, not fully, but he could feel it, the shape of something forming just beyond reach, something that did not belong to the man he had become over the past 10 years, but to someone he had been before that, someone he had tried to leave behind along with everything else. "Where did you get this?" he asked, and the question came out low, almost careful, because he already knew the answer mattered more than he wanted it to. And when he finally lifted his eyes to her again, she was watching him not with expectation, but with quiet certainty, as if this moment was unfolding exactly the way it was meant to. "It was kept," she said, her voice steady, carrying no judgment, only truth, because it was given when it was needed. And Ethan felt something tighten in his chest at those words, because they did not accuse, they did not demand. They simply placed the past in front of him without asking permission. He shook his head slightly, not in denial, but in an attempt to steady the thoughts beginning to surface, because he did not like the way they moved, not in straight lines, not in order, but in fragments, in pieces that came together slowly, stubbornly, refusing to be ignored. He looked down again at the cloth, and this time he saw more than just its shape. He saw the faint marks along one edge, darker than the rest, faded but still there, and something in his memory shifted again, sharper now, clearer, a flicker of movement, of storm clouds gathering, of wind cutting through open land, and a figure, not clear enough to name, but present enough to feel, and his hand tightened slightly without him realizing it. "I do not remember," he said, but even as the words left him, he knew they were no longer entirely true, because memory was no longer absent. It was returning, slow and steady, like water finding its way back through dry ground. She stepped closer then, just enough that the space between them felt different, smaller, more immediate, and when she spoke again, her voice carried something new, not stronger, not louder, but deeper, as if it reached into the space between them and settled there. "You did not stay," she said, and the words did not sound like blame, they sounded like understanding. And that was what made Ethan look up sharply, because he had expected accusation, expected something harder, something that would push him back into the walls he had built. But instead she gave him something else, something that left no room to hide. "You helped, and then you left," she continued, her eyes steady on his. "And that was enough?" And for a moment, the world seemed to narrow around those words, the creek, the wind, the distant horizon all fading into the background as Ethan stood there holding a piece of his own past in his hand and realizing that whatever he had done, whatever moment this cloth belonged to, it had not been as small as he had told himself it was. The breeze moved again, lifting the edge of his coat slightly, carrying the scent of dust and sage between them, and Ethan felt that same quiet certainty settle deeper inside him. The understanding that he had been wrong about something, not in a way that could be corrected with a simple answer, but in a way that would require him to look back, to face something he had avoided for years. And as he stood there, looking at her, at the calm in her expression, at the way she did not press him, did not rush him, he realized that whatever was coming next was not something he could walk away from. Not this time, because some moments, no matter how long ago they happened, did not end when you left them. They waited, unchanged, until you were ready to understand what they had really meant. The wind shifted again, and this time it carried something colder with it, not in temperature but in feeling, the kind that settles along a man's spine when a memory finally decides to stop hiding and step forward into the light. And Ethan felt it before he understood it, his grip tightening around the cloth as if it might steady him, but it did not. It only made the edges of that old moment sharper, clearer, until the past was no longer something distant. It was something standing just behind his eyes. He closed them for a brief second, not long enough to lose the present, just long enough to let the fragments align. And when they did, it came back not as a story but as a series of sensations, the sound of rain striking hard against dry earth, the smell of wet dust rising into the air, the weight of urgency pressing against his chest, and a figure struggling against something unseen but undeniable, and his own hands moving without hesitation, pulling, steadying, holding on when letting go would have been easier. He opened his eyes again, slower this time, and the creek was still there, the girl still standing before him. But everything felt different now, as if the space between them had been filled with something neither of them could ignore anymore. "It was a storm," he said quietly, more to himself than to her, and the words carried a weight that had not been there before, because now they were not guesses. They were pieces of something real, something he had lived and then chosen to forget. And she nodded once, a small movement, but enough to confirm that he was no longer reaching blindly. He was remembering. Ethan looked down at the cloth again, and now he could see it for what it was, not just fabric, but something torn from his own sleeve, a piece given without thought in a moment when nothing else mattered except keeping someone steady, keeping them present. And the realization settled deep, not as pride, not as regret, but as understanding. That the moment had not been as small as he had told himself it was. There was someone, he continued, his voice steadying as the memory took shape. Caught in the rain, near the ridge west of here, maybe 20 miles out, and he paused, because distance meant something to him. It always had, but now it felt different, like those miles had been carrying more than just land between them. They had been carrying time, carrying a connection he had not known still existed. She watched him closely, not interrupting, not guiding, only allowing the memory to unfold in its own way. And that patience gave him room to continue, to follow the thread wherever it led. She could not stand, he said, and there was no judgment in his tone, no fear, only fact. And I did what needed to be done, nothing more. But even as he said it, he felt the truth shift slightly, because it had not been nothing, not to her, not to the person standing in front of him now. And that was the part he had not understood until this moment. The girl stepped closer again, and now there was only a step or two between them, close enough that he could see the way her eyes softened, not with emotion that demanded attention, but with something quieter, something like acknowledgement. And when she spoke, her voice carried that same calm certainty that had been there from the beginning. She told me about the man who stayed until the storm passed. And Ethan felt his breath catch, not because of what she said, but because of how she said it, not as a story, not as something distant, but as something personal, something that belonged to her as much as it had ever belonged to him. I did not stay long, he replied, almost automatically, because that was the version of the story he had kept, the one that made it smaller, easier to carry, easier to forget. But she shook her head slightly, not in disagreement, but in correction, gentle but firm. You stayed long enough, she said, and those words settled into him in a way that nothing else had so far, because they did not change what he had done, they changed what it meant. And for the first time in years, Ethan felt the weight of something he had not allowed himself to feel, not guilt, not regret, but significance, the understanding that a moment he had dismissed as small had continued on without him, had grown, had become something that stood here now in the form of a young woman who looked at him not as a stranger, not as a passing figure, but as part of her own story. The creek moved quietly beside them, unchanged, steady, as if it had seen this kind of thing before. The way lives crossed and separated and then found each other again when the time was right. And Ethan stood there holding that piece of cloth, no longer just a remnant of the past, but a bridge between what had been and what was now. And he realized, slowly but clearly, that understanding was not something that arrived all at once. It came in layers, in moments like this, when the past stepped forward and asked to be seen for what it truly was, not something to leave behind, but something that had never really left him at all. The air between them seemed to settle into something heavier, not tense, not dangerous, but full, like a space that had been waiting a long time to be filled with the truth of what it carried. And Ethan stood there with the cloth still in his hand, no longer turning it, no longer studying it, because he did not need to anymore. He knew what it was now, and more importantly, he knew what it meant, not just to him, but to her. And that realization shifted something deeper than memory. It shifted the way he saw the moment itself, no longer as something finished and left behind, but as something that had continued without him, growing in ways he had never considered. He looked at her again. Really looked this time. Not as a stranger standing across a creek, not as someone tied to a memory, but as a person shaped by that memory, and he saw it now, in the steadiness of her posture, in the quiet strength of her gaze, in the way she stood without needing to prove anything, as if the truth she carried was already enough. She told you about that night, he said, and his voice had changed again, softer now, less guarded. Because there was no reason to guard something that had already found him, and she nodded. Once, her expression unchanged but not distant, present, grounded, like someone who had grown up with a story and had finally reached the place where it began. She said the storm would have taken her if you had not stopped, she replied, and there was no exaggeration in her tone, no attempt to make the moment larger than it was. Just a simple truth spoken the way it had been passed down. And Ethan felt that truth settle into him with a weight that was not heavy, but steady, like something aligning after being out of place for too long. He let out a slow breath, his shoulders easing slightly as he took in her words, not resisting them, not questioning them, just allowing them to exist. And for the first time in years, he did not try to make the past smaller than it was. He did not reduce it to something manageable, something forgettable. He let it stand as it was, a moment that had mattered, even if he had not stayed to see what came after. "I did not know," he said, and the words came out simple, unembellished, but they carried more than they seemed, because they were not just about that night. They were about everything that had followed, everything he had chosen not to know, and she seemed to understand that without him needing to explain it. She took another small step closer, and now there was no distance left that mattered. Only the quiet space of two people standing in the same place at the same time, connected by something neither of them had created alone. And when she spoke again, her voice carried something new, not just certainty, but warmth, subtle but unmistakable. She kept the cloth because she said it reminded her that kindness does not ask to be remembered. And Ethan felt that line settle deeper than anything else had so far, because it struck something in him he had not put into words before. The reason he had left, the reason he had not stayed to see the outcome, because he had believed that what he did was simply what needed to be done, nothing more, nothing that required acknowledgement. He looked down at the cloth once more, and now it felt different in his hand, not heavier, but clearer, like its purpose had finally been understood, and he realized that he had been wrong in one quiet but important way, not about what he had done, but about what it had become. She was wrong about one thing, he said slowly, lifting his eyes back to hers. And for a moment there was a hint of something unfamiliar in his expression, not regret, not pride, but something closer to acceptance. Kindness may not ask to be remembered, but it does not disappear. And the words lingered between them, not as a statement, but as a realization forming in real time. And she watched him as if she recognized that change, as if she had been waiting not for him to remember the event, but for him to understand it. The wind moved again, softer now, carrying the quiet sound of the creek and the faint rustle of dry grass along the banks. And everything about the moment felt still in a different way, not paused, not waiting, but settled, like something that had been unresolved had finally found its place. And Ethan stood there with the past no longer behind him, no longer hidden, but standing beside him, part of the same ground he now stood on. And for the first time in a long while, he did not feel the need to step away from it. He simply stood and let it be what it was, something real, something lasting, something that had found its way back to him not with force, not with demand, but with quiet certainty, carried in the eyes of someone who had never forgotten what he had tried so hard to leave behind. The quiet did not feel empty anymore. It felt complete, like something that had been circling for years had finally come to rest between them, and Ethan stood there with the cloth in his hand. And the weight of understanding settling deeper than he expected, not heavy, not overwhelming, but steady, the kind of steady that did not fade when the moment passed. And for the first time in a long while, he did not look for a way to step out of it. He watched her carefully, not with suspicion, not with distance, but with a kind of attention he had not given anyone in years. And he began to see more than just the connection to that night. He saw the way she carried herself with quiet purpose. The way her presence did not ask for space but naturally held it. And it occurred to him that she had not come here just to return something, not just to close a circle. There was something more, something still unspoken. "You came a long way," he said, his voice low but certain. And this time it was not a question, it was an acknowledgement, because distance mattered out here. Miles meant time, meant effort, meant intention. And she gave a small nod in return, her eyes never leaving his, as if that distance had never been the difficult part. "I was told where to find you," she said, and her words carried a quiet clarity, not mysterious, not dramatic, just direct. And Ethan felt a slight tension return, not the old kind, not fear, but curiosity, because he had not made it easy to be found, not by anyone, and certainly not by someone who had never met him before this moment. "By who?" he asked, and there was no sharpness in it, only the need to understand how something he had left behind had managed to reach him again after all this time. She glanced briefly toward the ridge beyond him, not as if someone was there, but as if the answer lived somewhere beyond the visible, somewhere tied to memory rather than place. And when she looked back at him, her expression had not changed, but her voice carried a slightly different weight, something deeper, something rooted in something older than either of them. By the one you helped, she said simply, and the words settled into the air with a quiet finality, not as a revelation meant to shock, but as a truth that had always been there, waiting to be spoken aloud. Ethan felt his breath slow again, not from surprise, but from the way those words connected everything. Not just the cloth, not just the memory, but the path that had led her here. The reason she stood in front of him now instead of remaining just a part of a story passed down through time. She is still alive, he said, and there was something in his voice now that had not been there before, not doubt, not disbelief, but something closer to careful hope, the kind that does not expect an answer but cannot help asking. The girl held his gaze for a moment longer, and then she nodded once, steady and certain. She is, she said, and she wanted you to know that what you did not end when you left. And those words settled deeper than anything else had so far, because they carried not just meaning, but continuity, the understanding that his actions had not been a single moment, but the beginning of something that had moved forward without him. Ethan looked down at the cloth again, and this time he did not see it as something from the past. He saw it as something that had traveled, something that had been kept, carried, preserved, not out of obligation, but out of recognition, and that realization shifted something in him again, quieter this time, but just as certain. Why come now? He asked, and his voice was softer than before, not because he feared the answer, but because he understood that whatever it was, it mattered. She did not answer immediately, and the silence that followed was not empty, it was measured, like she was choosing her words not for their impact, but for their truth. And when she finally spoke, her voice carried that same calm strength that had been there from the beginning. Because she said there are things a man should hear while he can still understand them. And Ethan felt that settle into him in a way that made him still, completely still, because it was not a warning, not a request, it was a simple acknowledgement of time, of the way it moved forward whether a man was ready or not. And for the first time since this moment began, he realized that this was not just about the past returning, it was about what he chose to do with it now, standing here, with the truth laid out in front of him as clearly as the land stretching out beyond the creek. And he did not move, did not speak, because some realizations did not need to be answered right away, they only needed to be understood. The silence that followed her words did not ask for anything. It simply remained, stretching out between them like the land itself, wide, steady, and patient, and Ethan stood there without moving, the cloth still resting in his hand, his fingers no longer tightening around it, no longer questioning it. Because something had shifted in a way that did not need to be forced into understanding, it simply settled into place. He looked past her for a moment, toward the far ridge where the sunlight had begun to soften, casting longer shadows across the uneven ground. And for the first time since she had appeared, he noticed how late it had become, how the day had moved forward without him marking it, without him measuring it the way he always did. And that alone told him something had changed. Because time had always been something he kept track of, something he controlled in small, careful ways, but now it had slipped by unnoticed, like a reminder that not everything followed the boundaries he had set. When he looked back at her, she had not moved, not stepped away, not pressed closer. She simply remained, as steady as she had been from the beginning, and there was something in that stillness that made him understand what she had not said yet, that this moment was not just about remembering. It was about deciding. He drew a slow breath, the kind that settles deeper than the lungs, the kind that reaches somewhere further inside, and for a moment he considered the path he had been walking for the past 10 years, the quiet, the distance, the way he had shaped his life around keeping things simple, contained, untouched by anything that might pull him back into something larger than himself. And he realized now that it had not been peace he had built, it had been avoidance. Careful and deliberate, but still avoidance. If she wanted me to know, he said slowly, his voice carrying more weight than before, not from hesitation, but from the clarity forming beneath it. Then there is more than just this. And he lifted the cloth slightly, not as a question, but as an acknowledgement that this could not be the only reason she had come. The girl watched him closely, and for the first time since they had met, there was a slight shift in her expression, not uncertainty, but something closer to relief, as if he had reached the place she had been waiting for him to find on his own. She asked me to tell you one thing, she said, and her voice was steady. But there was something softer beneath it now, something that carried more than just words, and Ethan felt himself listening in a way he had not in years, not just hearing, but allowing the meaning to reach him without resistance. She said that night was not the moment you changed her life. The girl continued, her gaze never leaving his. It was the moment you showed her what kind of man you already were. And the words settled into him with a quiet force, not sharp, not overwhelming, but undeniable. And for a second, Ethan did not react, not outwardly, but inside. Something shifted in a way he had not expected, because he had spent years believing that what he did defined him only in that moment. Something separate from who he was the rest of the time. Something that did not need to be carried forward. He looked down at the cloth again, but now it did not feel like something tied to a single event. It felt like something that had been pointing to something larger all along. Something he had chosen not to see. And what does she want now? He asked, and there was no resistance left in his voice, no distance, only a quiet readiness to hear whatever answer came next. The girl held his gaze for a long moment, as if weighing not just the question, but the man who was asking it. And then she shook her head slightly, not dismissing the question, but reframing it. She does not want anything, she said. She wanted you to understand. And that answer, simple as it was, carried more weight than any request could have, because it left no obligation, no demand, only a truth placed in front of him and the choice of what to do with it. The wind moved again, softer now, carrying the faint sound of distant birds and the steady flow of the creek, and everything around them felt quieter, not because the world had changed, but because something inside him had settled into place, something that no longer needed to be avoided or ignored. Ethan nodded once, slowly, not as agreement, not as acceptance of something forced upon him, but as recognition, the kind that comes when a man finally sees something clearly after years of looking past it. And he realized then that understanding was not the end of anything. It was the beginning of a choice, and for the first time in a long while, he did not feel the need to turn away from that choice. He simply stood there, steady, present, and let the moment become what it was meant to be. The light had begun to dip lower behind the ridge, turning the edges of the land into long, quiet shadows that stretched across the creek bed, and Ethan stood there with the last of her words settling into him, not as something that demanded a response, but as something that had already found its place. And for a long moment neither of them spoke, because nothing needed to be said that had not already been understood. He looked at her again, not searching this time, not questioning, just seeing. Seeing the person who had carried a story across miles and years without changing it, without bending it to make it easier or heavier, just keeping it as it was meant to be kept. And he realized that there was a kind of strength in that he had never learned, not the kind that built fences or held ground, but the kind that remembered without bitterness and returned without expectation. She took a step back then, small, almost unnoticeable at first, but enough to change the space between them. And Ethan felt it immediately, not as loss, but as completion, like a circle that had quietly closed without needing acknowledgement. He did not move to stop her, did not ask her to stay, because something in him understood that this had never been about holding on. It had been about seeing clearly, and now that he did, there was nothing left to reach for. "Will you tell her?" he said, and his voice was steady, not heavy, not uncertain, just grounded in the moment as it was. "That I understand." And the words felt right in a way that did not need to be tested or explained, and she nodded once. The same quiet certainty she had carried from the beginning, as if that had always been enough. She turned then, not abruptly, not with finality, just a natural movement, like someone following a path that had already been chosen. And as she stepped away from the creek, the sound of her footsteps was soft against the sand, nearly lost beneath the steady flow of water and the faint whisper of wind moving through the grass. Ethan watched her go, not tracking every step, not holding on to the details, just letting the image settle into memory the way the moment itself had settled into understanding. And he noticed how the light caught the turquoise at her neck one last time before she moved beyond the edge of the creek and into the open stretch of land beyond, where distance would soon take her out of sight. He stood there long after she had gone, the cloth still in his hand, but now it did not feel like something separate from him. It felt like something that belonged exactly where it was, a reminder not of what had happened, but of what it had meant, and he slowly folded it once, carefully this time, not out of urgency, but out of respect, and slipped it into his coat pocket where it rested close without needing to be seen. His horse shifted beside him, nudging lightly against his shoulder as if reminding him that the world had not stopped, that there were still miles to ride, still work to be done, and Ethan reached up, resting his hand along the animal's neck, the familiar motion grounding him in the present again. But the present no longer felt the same as it had before. It felt wider somehow, less confined by the lines he had drawn around it. He turned slightly, looking out across the land that stretched beyond the creek, the same land he had known for years, but now it held something different, not new, but newly seen, like a place that had always been there but had only just been understood. The sun dipped lower, casting a softer glow across the horizon, and Ethan took a slow breath, letting it fill him without resistance, without the need to push anything away. And, for the first time in a long while, he did not feel the need to measure the distance between himself and everything else. He simply stood where he was, present, steady, and certain in a way that did not come from knowing everything, but from finally understanding something that had been waiting for him all along. Out here, the land did not speak in words. It did not explain or justify. It simply held what was true and let a man decide when he was ready to see it. And Ethan Cole, standing by that quiet creek with the last light of day settling over him, understood at last that some things were never meant to be left behind. They were meant to find their way back, not with noise, not with force, but with the kind of silence that only a man willing to stand still could finally hear.